Hi, I'm Ed Jaffe, and welcome back to the Woodwind Legacy Series. Today we're at Yamaha Artist Services showcase room in Midtown Manhattan, and we're here with one of the great Yamaha artists, who's also one of the most formidable saxophone players in the world today, and I'm so grateful that he's going to be spending this afternoon with us and talking about his life. Steve Wilson has been a major force in jazz for over 30 years now. He's recorded well over 150 albums, and he has 11 albums himself as a leader. But Steve is not only a great player, he's also a wonderful jazz educator, and we're going to be speaking with him about both of those worlds today. So please help me welcome Steve Wilson.
Yeah,
Thanks.
nice to be with you.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks for
you.
spending your afternoon with us. And you know, I just like to start off these type of interviews with getting a little background for those perhaps the younger players, maybe who don't know as much about you. I know you grew up in Virginia and ultimately went to Virginia Commonwealth as a music major, but can you talk a little bit about how you got started in music, your first instrument, and how things progressed, you know, to the point where you moved to New York as a budding professional and your career took off?
Yeah, well, my father had a small but eclectic record collection. I grew up in the 60s and 70s, so he had everything from Motown to Johnny Mathis to Mario Lanza to James Brown to the Beatles, you know, just a whole array of music. So I kind of heard music around the house via recordings. And then in 1968, George Wein started a festival in Hampton, Virginia, it's the town I'm from, which was actually many of the artists from Newport. At Newport Jazz Festival.
I see. So they would come down after the Newport Festival and tour a little bit.
Yeah, and that was kind of the beginning of the circuit that George was putting together. And every summer they would come through and play at what is now Hampton University. Then it was Hampton Institute. And I grew up less than a mile from there. My father would take me there every summer to hear a lot of great artists, and that's really what spurred me to want to play music.
Wow. And did your dad play any instrument, or was there any actual instrumental music being played at the home on the piano or anything of that nature?
No instrumental music at all. He sang in a choir, in a all-male gospel and spiritual choir, and he would take me with him to their concerts and travel around a bit.
Right. So where did you come to, you know, playing a saxophone? How did that come about?
Yeah. Well, when the record Swiss Movement came out, Eddie Harris and Les McCann. My father had that record, and also Quincy Jones' Walking in Space. And I took a liking to both of those records. And then a few years later, he took me to the festival, and I saw Eddie Harris and Les McCann play, and also Cannonball Adderley was on the festival with the Country Preacher Band, you know, towards the end of Zavino's run. And also Rahsaan Roland Kirk. So seeing those three guys really is what spurred me to want to play saxophone.
So like so many musicians, being the actual presence of live music making, not just being in front of the computer hearing stuff, but the live presence really spurred you.
Absolutely.
To play. And so did you ask to play saxophone in the school or something of that nature?
Yeah, well, I asked them to get me a saxophone, and they held off, my parents did, because they thought it was a phase. And also that, you know how kids go through their phases, because before that I wanted to be a drummer. So they bought me this toy drum kit, which I totally annihilated within a month. But they didn't have a school band program, an instrumental program in my elementary school. But starting in junior high school, 7th grade, I started on saxophone. And of course, played in symphonic wind band, marching band, jazz band, what everyone else does.
Right. Did you have a teacher, a saxophone teacher, to actually help guide you, or was it the school teacher that was the main force?
It was the school teacher, and actually he was the first year the teacher was a clarinetist, and the second year my teacher was a saxophonist, and he actually started me on tenor in the jazz band because I really wanted to be a tenor player at that time. And I remember the first time I had to improvise. He gave me a chart. We were playing Carole King's "I Feel the Earth Move," and he gave me this chart with these chord changes on it. And I said, "Hey, you gave me the guitar part." And he said, "No, these are chord changes." He said, "I'll show you what notes to play." And that's kind of what started me with improvising, at least from the paper.
Interesting. And so when you went to high school, that continued, I imagine, playing in
Yes.
school bands and so forth?
Yeah, well, I had two other important teachers there in high school. The first teacher, Dan Bolarski, was a student of James Hulick, the great classical tenor saxophonist.
Right.
And he brought in James to do a master class for our school system one year, and we got to see him, and that was really amazing. I'd never heard the saxophone do those kind of things that he could do with the overtones and the kind of control.
Right.
And he was a great band director. We won all kinds of awards with symphonic band and jazz band, and also in that band, who was ahead of me, a year or two ahead of me, was Jonathan Helton, a great classical saxophonist who's now at the University of Florida,
Right.
who I just reconnected with not too long ago after 30 years. It was pretty amazing. So I had him to kind of look at as a great example of saxophone playing.
Right.
And then following after that was Al Morris, who was a working musician around town playing trombone and bass, and really exposed us to a lot of the jazz greats. You know, we brought in videos and recordings, and we were playing some of the Martin charts at the time, and he introduced me to some of the local musicians. So,
Right.
so all of those teachers were really instrumental in me progressing.
Right. So many of the musicians I've met in my lifetime, and so many that I've interviewed in this series, it seemed school music programs were so important in their sort of getting off the ground and finding a love for music that they eventually, transferred into their careers.
Yeah.
It's so important, and so many school programs are cutting that aspect of their budget, and it's really a loss for society when we do that. And I know we'll talk a little bit more about music education later on in the interview, because you've been vitally connected in that area for many years now.
Yeah.
But going on to how you gravitated towards the alto and finding your voice in jazz, where did the transfer from tenor to alto occur?
Well, probably midway through my high school years, and I got exposed to the super sax recordings, those Charlie Parker recordings, and that was one thing. And then the next thing, I was home practicing one day during the summer. I think I was about 15 or 16, and our postal carrier, of course we called him the mailman then, but he had dropped the mail in the box, and then he peeked his head in the window and said, "Hey, what are you playing there?" And I just said, "Oh, I'm just trying to play some scales." He said, "Do you know the whole tone scale?" And I went, "What?" So he came in, he says, "Give me your horn." And he took my alto, and he showed me the whole tone scale, and I sat there with my mouth just, what? I never knew this guy played saxophone. And he said, "Yeah, you got to learn these two whole tone scales." And then he said, "Now you got to go out and get some Charlie Parker records."
And who was this masked
yeah,
man?
right. Well, he was actually a family friend, but I never knew at the time he played saxophone.
Wow.
And it turns out years later, after he retired from the post office, he opened a music shop there and became the best repairman in town, in my hometown. So,
isn't it amazing how you might say good fortune plays a role in one's life and directing one? It just brings to mind a quick aside from an old colleague of mine who I haven't seen in years, but we sat next to each other at a show for a number of years, a wonderful jazz tenor player, Tom Christensen.
Oh yeah, sure, no Tom.
And
yeah,
Tom grew up in the Bay Area, and he was studying saxophone, and his mother was walking down the street one day and heard someone playing saxophone, knocked at the door and said, "Listen, can you give, my son's studying saxophone, something like that. Can you, give him lessons?" And it ended up being Joe Henderson.
Oh my God! Wow. Tom never told me that. That's amazing.
When he told me that, I fell out of the chair. I probably missed my entrance of the show.
Yeah, right.
I just couldn't believe.
That's amazing.
I mean, I hope I'm not exaggerating, but it was something sort of like that. And it was like, what are the odds?
Yeah, you couldn't script that.
And Tom
better.
studied with Joe for a number of years as I think as a high school student.
Wow, that's
before
fantastic.
he moved to New York. But I mean, these are the type of stories that make it interesting, and also makes very clear that the young a person playing music can be influenced so greatly by a mentor, a teacher, a parent, a friend.
Absolutely.
You know, and the difference that it makes. I just, the prior interview I did was with Stanley Drucker, and
Oh,
he
wow.
mentioned how at 11 years old he began studying with Leon Rushinoff, who was
Wow.
the guy recommended by a local music store person. And Leon Rushinoff was a young player at the time and gave his all to Stanley, gave him his mouthpiece that he's played his entire career. I mean,
Wow.
a fortuitous meeting of
Yeah.
the minds. I mean, it's so interesting to see how this
Absolutely.
progresses. But
Absolutely, yeah.
so once you got hooked on alto and you started investigating Bird and maybe more about theory and scales, you're in college now at Virginia Commonwealth, and you're a music performance major, I gather.
Yes.
What were the influences there that helped push you further?
Yeah, well, that was also another important period for me. Of course, moving away from home, I wasn't that far, 80 miles, but still, you know, just asserting my individuality. But discovering and being mentored by a wonderful teacher there, Doug Richards, who was the director of the jazz program, and he was the one that turned me on to Ellington, and that's where I discovered Johnny Hodges, and it just transformed my personal and musical life forever. To this day, he's my personal favorite on the alto.
That's so funny. We're here in Yamaha, and Tomoji Hirakata, our great friend who works here, is the woodwind repairman, and I were talking just before you got here, and about you know, how I like to warm up. And I'm going to ask you how you warm up in a little bit. But one of the things that I find most helpful is while I'm assembling the horn to put on some Hodges, something like hearing him play All of Me, you know, just that vibe, and just trying to imitate that for the few minutes, because Johnny Hodges played the saxophone so well, and every note had such nuance and such character and vibrancy. I mean, it's like perfect alto
Absolutely.
playing. You know, that's we've never talked about that, but I couldn't agree with you more, and it's such a wonderful voice to find.
Yeah, it is. It is.
You know, now progressing from your college studies to where you are now a member of the OTB band, Out of the Blue band, Blue Note, with 5 other talented young players for Blue Note Records. How did that all come about? How did you move from the student to the budding professional?
Yeah, well, I was working at that time in Richmond, Virginia, where VCU is located. Was a spectacular period, the early 80s, because the school was opening up, the jazz program was opening up. That's where I met Jimmy Heath and the Heath Brothers, because we had many artists in residence who came down, including the Heath Brothers, Frank Foster, Jackie Byard, Woody Shaw. I mean, it was incredible.
These were people who came in as clinicians?
Yeah, and they would stay for a few days. Benny Carter, I got to play with Benny Carter, so, you know, he brought in some of the further definitions charts. So it was an amazing period to be around all of these great people, and that was really what, you know, spurred me to want to be in New York. So I think it was 1984, 85. I got called to be one of the local players on the Broadway show, Sophisticated Ladies.
Right.
And the lead alto player in the touring band was Kenny Garrett. And that's where I met Kenny, And Kenny and I got to hang out and know each other a bit. And so a couple of years later, when the group Out of the Blue, OTB, had been formed and they had recorded, and Kenny was getting ready to leave the band to join Art Blakey and subsequently Miles, and he called me to see if I wanted to take the chair of OTB. And I said, sure, I'd love to give it a try. And that's really what got me to New York.
Wow.
Yeah.
Again, fortuitous meetings and things that happen in life, and it just leads from one road to the other.
Exactly.
Yeah, but you obviously had the goods. That's what we want to get at, you know, how you arrived at your craft and how you practice your craft, so that, because that's ultimately at the core of every positive and fortuitous situation that occurs in music, ultimately. So were you a hard practicer? Certainly by the time you got to college, were you like had your focus totally on that? Were you single-minded in your approach to the instrument and towards learning your craft?
Yeah, and you know, at that time, while I was still in school and just after I got out of school, still living in Richmond, I was doing a lot of different kinds of work. I was doing studio work, jingles, I was playing in big bands, large ensembles, so I was
Wow.
started doubling quite a bit. Actually, I was a flute major in college for 1 year.
Wow.
And my flute teacher, Francine Belush, man, she dipped me in the deep end of the pool. I went to her saying, "Oh, you know, Fran, I would just like to be a good doubler." She says, "No, you're in my studio now, and you're just like all of the other flute players." And I went, "Oh my God, what did I get myself into?"
That's
But
beautiful.
I'm grateful for it because
Yeah.
it helped my saxophone playing. And I was an
Absolutely.
oboe major my first year.
Really?
Yeah, I was an oboe major my first year. Actually, was on a scholarship as an oboist.
What got into you? Come on, man. Wow.
Well, I gave it up after a year.
Yeah,
It was
that-
just
it's-
a lot to keep up.
Sure.
But there again, I had a great teacher, and it really helped my overall musicianship and my diaphragm and my muscles and the whole thing. I still have a great appreciation for the instrument.
Right, and you still play saxophones, soprano, alto mainly, and clarinet and flute, and there are many videos up on YouTube, and I saw one earlier yesterday, I believe. I was watching, and where you were soloing on clarinet.
Oh boy!
I think it was maybe with Chick. There was something.
Yeah, maybe.
There was a tune. It was I think one of the tangos or something.
Right.
Something.
I think it was Anna's tango.
Yeah, right. I know. If we all heard you play flute, certainly with Maria Schneider's band and as part of the section playing. And so you've been a multi-instrumentalist for many years then, since you're quite young.
Yeah. Well, being in a big band at school and starting we were playing all of those great charts by Gil Evans and Duke and all the clarinet stuff and Thad Mel.
So in addition to flute, did you study clarinet as well with a teacher at any point?
I did not. I did not study clarinet. Most of it I got on my own and just getting tips from different people and getting the books and watching people and what they did and asking advice. So,
Right.
yeah.
Right. Do you still practice your doubles as on a sort of regular basis as well as your saxophone?
Mostly flute when I'm practicing. Clarinet is on a need basis because I don't play that much clarinet outside of Maria's band or from subbing in the Vanguard band.
Right.
But flute, I love playing the flute, and so I try to keep that up as much as I can.
Okay. Well, let's touch upon your practice routine now, and then we'll go back to your evolution coming into New York. What are the things that you actually do practice on saxophone and flute on a regular basis? Are there specific exercises or even study books that you tend to gravitate to?
Yeah, well, on saxophone, and I actually had made a list. I wrote out a bunch of stuff just so I wouldn't forget. Well, there are several books that I like to play from, and the one that I always go back to are the Fairling 48 studies, because I started with that when I was taking classical lessons my first year in school, and I got away from it, and then I went through an embouchure change. I guess around the age of 24. And I had a guy in D.C., Tony Valente, who was a great repairman and also a great woodwind doubler, who told me more about a natural embouchure, natural lip position, because I was tucking in a lot of bottom lip, therefore creating a lot of pressure and muting the reed. And he got me to change my embouchure. And right away I got 30% more sound. And it just made everything so much more efficient.
Right.
So what I did with that, I changed mouthpieces. I was able to come down in size mouthpieces, a little soft on the reeds. And then I went back to the Fairling studies to get the control. And that was really what helped me to line everything up in terms of my sound, my tone, my intonation, and just making everything line up properly.
I think that's also a pretty important point, that playing written music, playing music that was designed for Western European classical music, or that is from that history, is not a negative thing for someone learning to play jazz on the instrument. Joe Allard, who was my principal teacher, used to say, you play both. Each helps one the other.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I found over my lifetime that that's good advice, and it was helpful to me, certainly. So that, a lot of schools, colleges for music majors segregate the majors. If you're a jazz major, you're here. If you're a concert saxophone major, you're here. And the two shall not intermingle, and they should not study this, music from one another's areas. And it's ridiculous.
It is ridiculous because it's more music, it's more knowledge, and there's so many, in terms of playing our instruments. Ultimately, no matter what kind of music we're playing, we're after a personal sound. everyone's after a personal sound, no matter what the genre is. So all of these things to me give you more tools to find your personal sound and to do it as efficiently as possible.
Right.
So
Sure. Yeah.
I'm all for more knowledge.
Great. And so in addition to the furling studies, are there any other exercises for saxophone that you find helpful? Is it warm up or is it a regular routine?
Yeah, the Joe Viola Creative Reading Studies, which that's the one book along with the furling that I've used religiously for over 20 years in both my own playing, practicing, and also my teaching. It's a great book for technique, for reading, obviously. It's a challenging book, but a very musical book, full of surprises, and it covers the whole thing. Altissimo, mixed meters, everything is in there. It's funny because, of course, in the last few years, we've seen a lot of younger players wanting to play in odd meters. And in that book, you have stuff in like 11/8 and 9/8, and it goes back and forth to 4/4.
That was written
5/4.
60 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
something like that. But
yeah, so it's a wonderful book and really great for any saxophonist of any style because I don't think it's a jazz book. It's not a classical book. I call it a modern music book.
right,
And to me, it's adaptable to anything that the saxophonist is doing.
right. So basically, you're citing Furling and Joe Viola's book. You're talking about a lot of reading as part of your routine, which might be surprising to those who are, jazz players and focusing, obviously on their creative improvisation abilities. But you found the reading aspect of it as well to be essential to your development as.
Absolutely. Well,
Yeah.
that's a carryover from my early training because.
Right.
In school, in junior high school and high school, during the day I was playing in symphonic wind band, jazz band. Of course, you have to be a good reader.
Right.
And then in the evenings, I was playing in the local funk bands and R&B bands that we had in our neighborhood.
Right.
So I was getting the best of both worlds, but that has always stayed with me, and that skill has allowed me to work.
Yeah, I mean that there is a key word there. That ultimately, you get out of school. You want to work now. Now, the more tools you have, the more marketable you are.
Exactly.
And it's not a bad thing.
No.
Are there any devices you use to get your creative juices going from an improvisational standpoint during your practice sessions?
Yeah, well, I try to do now what I call creative practicing. And what I mean by that is after I go through a routine of long tone scales and certain things that I do to get opened up and warmed up and just to get everything going, usually my practicing revolves around new repertoire that I'm learning for someone's original music and as well as my own, because everyone's writing these days. So I'm always learning some new music for a gig that's coming up. And they'll send the charts, and of course I have to get out the charts and start to work it through and figure out the lines and maybe some fingerings and start to play through the changes. And then after I'm doing that, like, okay, as I'm getting a feel for it, like, well, let's see what this sounds like if I can play through the changes or learn to play freely over that. So I work it a lot from that repertoire, but also if I'm working on a certain I won't call it a pattern, but a sequence or a certain fingering, something I'm trying to get together with my fingering, I try to put that at the end of my practicing. I call it the last 5 to 10% to put it into an organic process. In other words, it's not, now I'm out of the regimented mode and I'll go into the open free playing mode to see if I can incorporate what I've been working on so that it begins to feel natural. And I will purposely start playing, whatever I've been working on to see if I can get the muscle memory working. But I want it to become organic and part of what I do, and so I don't have to think about it all the time.
Right. Interesting. Wow. Yeah. And when you do get to flute, whether it's daily or every week, whatever, what are the things you practice on your flute?
Yeah. Well, I practice the flute mainly for sound. And the thing that I always go to, it's been on YouTube for a bunch of years now, but there's a James Galway master class. And he talks about embouchure and sound. And I think it's part 3 and 4. And I always go to that. And I just start there. And to see if I can center, get the aperture going, center my aperture, get the center of that sound, go in the low register, try to get the fullness and the buzz. And then I'll go from there, and I'll go to scales or to overtones, and then also there's another recording, Hubert Law's recording, Passion Flower.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, of course, which he recorded for Atlantic in the '60s.
Yeah.
And just the beginning of that, doo dee dee doo dee 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 doo dee, and I literally will play along with that.
Yeah.
To try and match that sound as much as I can, because that also opens things up. And I feel like from there, I'm like, okay, whatever I need to do from there, I'm okay. But mainly it's about sound with flute.
Yeah, that's interesting. I know for myself, when I was studying flute, and my teachers were classically oriented, just playing along with sometimes their recordings or recordings of Julius Baker or Ron Paul or William Bennett or whatever, would somehow magically, you sound better after. I don't know if it's delusional, but it makes you at least think that you're sounding better. But it's such a great thing to play along with records. Jazz players have always played along with records transcribing solos. But there's also a benefit in trying to emulate the sound qualities and the inflections,
absolutely.
Regardless of the musical style.
Absolutely, and there's so much color in the flute, as you know. I mean, there's just so much color to be discovered. And you can find that sweet spot. Man, it's whoa.
Right. And it's great. You don't have to deal with a reed.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Let's get back a little bit to now. You've sort of moved into the professional ranks, and you moved to New York finally in 1987. You've been here over 30 years now. Yeah. How did you start building your career once you arrived in New York?
Yeah, well, ironically, after I had been in OTB for about a year before I moved to New York, and then I came in '87, and the band actually had very little work, so I had to start from scratch. And that meant, going out and meeting people, the jam sessions, and using my contacts. And then the first or second week I was in town, Mike Mossman, who was the trumpeter in OTB, called me and said, "Hey, man, if you're not doing anything tonight," he was playing a Broadway show. I think it was Starlight Express.
Oh, yes.
About the folks on roller skates and stuff.
Yeah, the roller derby. Yeah.
And he says, "Well, look, come down and sit in the pit, and I'll introduce you to some guys." And then the band was Dick Oates, who I was already a big fan of, and a few other guys who I'd heard about. And Oates took my number, and he called me the following week to sub in the Vanguard band. Of course, it was still, Thad. I was still Mel there at the time, and I couldn't believe that he gave me a call because, he had just met me the week prior. So I went down and subbed in the band that night, and though I didn't think I did okay, but Mel came over after the set and said, "Hey kid, you did great. I'll have Oates to call you back." And I thought, wow, but it was an exhilarating experience because I'm sitting between Joe Lovano and Ted Nash, and then there's Gary Simoian and La Lama, and then all the guys in the brass section, and then of course Mel, who just made everything feel so good, man. Most of us played some of those charts in college, and we think, yeah, I've played that before. You haven't really played that until you played it with the band. It's great to play it in school, don't get me wrong, but when you play it with Mel, it's an entirely different ball game, and that ride cymbal, man, was like an old shoe. It just made it feel so comfortable, and which affects how you play.
Sure.
So from that point on, I've been subbing in the band off and on since then. Wow. And it's always a great experience. Right. Then I joined Lionel Hampton's band in 1988, and went on my first European tour, and I stayed with him for about 8 months, and then of course just from there on meeting different guys in different bands and getting calls to do different kinds of gigs.
Right. But the idea also is that you're still moving your craft. You're still trying to grow and trying to improve and
absolutely
and practice. So many young players that I meet. Most of the young players that I meet are woodwind doublers, because that's sort of the area that I work in, and I find that they don't study after graduating so much, and that's a little disarming for me. But I hope that these type of videos and hearing someone like you also say how you kept working at it and growing
Oh,
and
yeah.
studying. I mean, because you don't end up playing with Chick Corea down the line, or Dave Holland, or Maria Schneider's band if you just stay stagnant. It's
Absolutely.
impossible to play with
Absolutely.
those level of musicians.
Absolutely. Well, moving to New York, I quickly discovered the level of musicianship here was just astoundingly high. And I was just telling a student of mine earlier today, I said, I really got my butt kicked when I moved here, but that's what I needed, that's what I wanted. And it was an interesting time because it was sort of the middle of the Young Lions period, and a lot of young musicians were getting signed to major record labels. I didn't really want to do that. I was involved with it by default, but I really moved here to play with the people I had admired on recordings, which I got to do. The Frank Wesses, the Jerry Dodgens, the Dick Oateses, who else am I thinking of? Jerome Richardson, who I played beside, and whose band was that? Clifford Jordan's big band. And I wanted to play with those elder musicians because of their craftsmanship, and those are the guys that I had always admired. I mean, I wanted to do the more adventurous stuff too, but that, when I looked at those guys and I looked at those albums, I said, that's what I want to do. I want to be in a section with this guy and that guy. And so I actually started practicing a lot more clarinet when I got here because I had to. You get called to go in a section, you got to have it together. So I had my Rose books, my Closé books, and practicing going across the break, whatever I had to do, and the flute books. So got tips from different people about what I could do to get better, but it was a necessity.
Right.
Yeah.
And this continues till today. I know we've talked about at various times different study books and so forth, and you're still engaged in looking at that. And certainly as a professor now, as an associate professor at City College here in New York, and you have so many young people's careers in your hands. I mean, it's necessary to keep looking and seeing what's out there, and to keep growing yourself in order to set that example for your students.
Right. Absolutely.
It really is. Let's just jump back a little bit before we get into your career as an educator. Who were the saxophone players growing up? You've named a few, obviously, early on with Eddie Harris and Cannonball, perhaps. But who were let's go to the alto players who really grabbed you and who have remained maybe as an important influence?
Yeah. Well, the first guy was Cannonball. When that Country Preacher record came out, I was listening to that record every day at home. I'd come home from school and put that record on and learn as many of the solos as I could. Didn't know the language. I didn't know the terminology even, but I was trying to learn the solos as much as I could. And then I got turned on to David Sanborn at that time because David's career was emerging. This was the 70s.
Yeah, absolutely.
And he was on a gazillion recordings, especially the CTI stuff. And then
James Taylor.
And then the second Brecker Brothers record.
Right.
And I was in the Michael Brecker as well. And but I was checking out so many different people.
And of course, you mentioned earlier Johnny Hodges and Bird early on. And who has remained with you? Now, all these wonderful players, who today still remains as perhaps the most important influences for you? If you were on a desert island, who were the alto players whose records you're going to carry and listen to?
Oh, boy, that would be a big list. But if I had to pare it down, really, it would be Hodges. It would be Hodges above all. Because for me, he's the central sound template that I think about when playing the alto saxophone. And I think about that as almost like a viola, a cello kind of quality, a warm singing quality with a beautiful core, and that you can go in any direction with in terms of color. So to me, he just encompasses that central point of the alto and getting right to the core of that sound where you can go any direction. And of course, you can hear that in Charlie Parker's playing. You can hear it in Cannonball's playing, Phil Woods, McPherson, all the great alto players. I mean, and then of course Benny Carter too. I'd have to put Benny right there. So, but those guys to me really set the template of great alto playing.
Right. And beyond the alto players, other musicians, not even saxophone players that you have found to be the most influential in your career. Who might some of those people be?
Well, I'm a drummer at heart. I'm really that.
In spite of what you did to your
Yeah,
drum set.
right. I'm still really. I love drums and I love drummers. So there's so many great drummers. My favorite drummer is Billy Higgins. He just has something unique and special. I mean, they all did, but and I did get to play with him one time, and I'm grateful for it. He was just had a joyous beat.
And always smiling.
Always smiling. That's what they call him, Smiling Billy Higgins.
Yeah.
But I had so many favorites, Roy Haynes and Elvin Jones, Mel, of course, Mel Lewis, just so many of them.
Yeah. And when it comes to teaching now, we're going to segue a little bit to teaching. Are these some of the musicians and saxophonists that you talk to your students about?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I urge my students to be a student of the instrument and student of the music. A couple of years ago, I did a sax seminar class at City College because I asked if I could do the special topics class, and we had enough saxophonists where I could run it. And it was an opportunity for me also to put all the things I've been thinking about in terms of teaching and the areas I wanted to cover and didn't get to cover before, to put it in a curriculum. So it was great. And I was a student too, because I could go back and learn some stuff. And so I started from the very beginning, like, okay, Adolph Sax, who were the first great masters of the saxophone in Europe, and how did it migrate to the United States and the whole history. And how did we get to this point? Because the saxophone has a very unique and storied history, as we know, among all of the other instruments.
It really does.
It's a very unique place.
And it's interesting that what you just mentioned, that brings back something my teacher, Joe Allard, told me once, because I was involved in teaching while I was still studying with him, and he said something I'll never forget, and it's the essence of good teaching. He said, to teach is to learn.
Absolutely.
And I found that over the years, in teaching people, especially if I'm teaching even some of the concepts that Joe Allard taught me, that in imparting it to students, I had to find a way to say it that it made sense to them, and I had to be able to demonstrate it. And actually, I think I learned more about how to incorporate Joe Allard's concepts from teaching than even when I was a student of him directly.
Yeah.
Because I had no choice. I had to. And it made me think of it from a different angle.
Absolutely.
And I'm so grateful for having the teaching experience, and I imagine you feel the same.
Yeah, because we have to formulate our ideas and communicate it. And so we have to say it in a clear and concise way, and in a way that really, it's like, okay, well, what am I really trying to get to in this particular concept? How does it affect what I do?
Right.
And so we're trying to impart that upon the students.
Right.
So it makes us really...
And you mentioned going back to Adolph Sax. I noticed in your reading your bio, just preparing for our video today, that a number of years ago, Steve Wilson, I saw you played the Villa-Lobos Fantasia with the Vermont Mozart Chamber Group, which is no easy feat. That is a difficult piece of music.
Well, it was my one public performance in the classical repertoire.
Yeah.
And that came about because when they were still doing the Mozart Festival in Burlington, Vermont some years ago, my manager knew the director, Mel Kaplan, and they wanted to start a jazz element to the series. And he asked me if I could prepare one classical piece, and I thought, oh my God. The first thing I knew, I didn't want to do a piece on alto, because I knew that would just be too difficult. But I started looking around for soprano repertoire.
Right.
And then I'd heard about the Villa-Lobos, but I'd never checked it out. And I checked it and I said, oh wow, that's the one I want to do. Yeah. And I started listening to different versions. And the main version I listened to was a guy from Greece, Theodore Kakezos. Amazing soprano and alto player in the classical world. And he had such a beautiful sound, the attack, everything, the bounce of the notes, the rhythms. So I used his performance as sort of the template in preparing the piece. Right. And I took about 4 to 5 months to prepare it and change some things on my horn.
It does that to you.
Yeah,
all of a sudden you have to play that high F in tune.
That's right. Yeah, so I had some of the keys closed a bit.
Yeah.
I got a different mouthpiece, but it really, to this day, it has served me playing the horn better. First of all, I love that piece of music. It's a great piece of music. I know Branford Marsalis has been playing it. He plays it beautifully, and it's just a fun piece to play. Challenging, but such a fun piece to play, and harmonically, it's you know, there's
Very
so many
interesting.
colors
Yes.
happen there.
Yeah,
So.
and to play it with a string orchestra is
Oh,
a treat.
yeah.
I've played it with piano. It's not the same.
Yeah, yeah,
the
yeah.
string playing it with strings is a real a lovely moment.
Yeah,
of music.
I got lucky. I hope to get to do it again sometime. 'Cause I
Yeah,
really
yeah.
enjoyed it.
But again, that incorporating other types of music in your playing, I think it has to come out in your sound and what you do primarily, and there is something to that. And that's one of the things I was going to reference in that there are not as many, in my opinion, and I've said this on other videos with other guests, that young alto players, jazz alto players, and by younger, I guess I should say 20s and 30s, okay, that I hear with full-bodied alto sounds who make use of vibrato and reflect some of the history in their sound. And I hear that history in your playing for sure. You know, obviously we hear it in Kenny Garrett, I hear it in Dick Oates, but it's not like a tenor player who also plays alto, and you can always tell. You can always tell.
Yeah.
I mean, the rarity is someone like Sonny Stitt who could sound so great on both, and you wouldn't know.
That's right.
You know, but I mean, you have the real, you know, solid, full-bodied alto sound with great resonance that does reflect some of the history of the great alto players of the past. How do you practice for tone on saxophone? You mentioned earlier, you talked about overtones and so forth,
Yeah.
and playing with records.
Yeah.
Are those the primary exercises used to sort of develop your sound?
Early on when I was listening to a lot of Cannonball, particularly, and just trying to get that depth of sound, and also Phil Woods. I went to a Phil Woods phase, and just
You think
you know,
you think he had a pretty resonant sound?
well, I have a Phil Woods story. I don't know if I told you. A few years ago, we were doing one of the series at the 92Y, you know, 92nd and Lex.
The one that Bill Charlap
Yeah.
coordinates.
Yeah, and we were doing some of the Benny Carter charts, the 5 saxophone section.
Oh, sure.
And Phil, of course, who, you know, had emphysema, and at the tank he had to carry around.
But when the horn went in the
when-
mouth.
Oh my God, man, the sound would just engulf you. And during one of the charts, now Phil was playing lead, so during one of the charts, I'm playing, and I can't hear myself, and I'm standing beside Phil because his sound is so big, I literally can't hear myself when I'm playing. And I said, this is unbelievable. This guy who's like, you know, 70-something years old with emphysema, he's just burying me. And so later that night when I go home, I get a taxi, my back, the muscles in my back locked up. I literally couldn't get in the taxi, and I had to have someone help me to get in. And I got home and I had to get help getting upstairs, and so luckily the next morning, my chiropractor lived across the street from me, and I said, man, I've got to see you right away, because I got back spasms like crazy. And then he asked me what did I do, and I said, well, I did, and I thought about it, and I remember that there was one point in the show where I exerted myself so hard trying to hear myself because of Phil.
Right.
And that's what threw my back out.
Yeah.
So I consider that a badge of honor.
Yeah.
And I told Phil that the next time I saw him, I said, yeah, kid, well, that's just the way I do it, you know.
Yeah, and it is probably the most resonant alto sound I ever heard in my life. It was scary. I heard him both when he was playing his Mark VI, and then I heard him years later with the Yamaha.
Yeah, yeah.
It didn't matter. I mean,
That's right.
it was just something there. And I think the guys who came up through that era playing the big bands where there wasn't miking on every saxophone,
Right,
and
that's
when they
right.
recorded in studios, they didn't have mics on every saxophone. You had
That's
to
right.
play to the mic in front. They learned how to get their sound out.
Absolutely. I think I've heard, you know, it's funny, years ago I was on a show with Elaine Stritch, and I heard her talking about, she was complaining about some of the young singers on Broadway because they didn't know how to
Elaine
project.
Stritch always complained.
Yeah, she complained about everything. But she was talking about the young singers, like, what is this with the clip-on mic? And they don't know how to project. They don't know how to project to the room. But it's the same thing.
Absolutely.
It's the same thing. And,
Sure.
But also what helped that experience for me was playing in the symphonic wind bands. My symphonic wind band training, playing both alto and oboe and English horn, because you get a sense of blend and building the diaphragm, and then also playing the big bands and playing I got to play in the American Jazz Orchestra during its last couple of years, and that's where I first got to play beside Jerry Dodgen. And I learned a lot from his sound, because Jerry's sound is very, very present, not loud, but
Right.
such
It
a
just
presence.
carries.
It carries.
Yes.
And the beautiful sound that he had. And
Yeah.
I thought, wow. And he made it feel so easy and so easy to blend with. So centering that tone, and of course he had a beautiful round sound. You know, has a beautiful round sound.
Yes.
And it became another sound model for me.
Yeah, yeah. The older musicians learned how to craft their sound so acoustically they didn't need the enhancement of
Exactly.
the mic to make it sound. And it's maybe an unfortunate thing in our technology that maybe sometimes we've lost some of that, because you don't have to do that now.
Yeah, and then you get to hear what you really sound like acoustically in context,
Right.
and you can use dynamics.
Right.
So all of that was very helpful.
Right. I just thinking back to a little anecdote Frank Foster shared with me years ago. When he joined the Basie Band, I think he was very young. I may be wrong, but I think he was in Wayne State University, if I remember, and maybe he was 19 or 20. He was a young fellow, and he was very nervous about playing in that section. And of course, he was seated right next to Marshall Royal.
Oh boy!
And he said he was just shaking inside. How is he going to play? How's he going to fit in? And he said the minute the downbeat started, Marshall Royal sound engulfed the whole sax section. That it made it so easy. He just took him along for the ride.
Yeah,
He said he never had a problem because Marshall Royal's sound was that present,
Wow.
not only going out, but across the section, which is, I mean, the art of a true master
Absolutely.
Saxophonist, and was certainly that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But so there is something to all of that.
Yeah, for sure.
So let's now talk a little bit about your equipment, because certainly that has to do with your resonance, your tone color, and how you feel about playing. If the equipment is such that you really enjoy it, there's nothing better. There's no better feeling.
Yeah.
So we're here at Yamaha, and you are a Yamaha artist.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how the Yamaha saxophone has helped your career and made life better for you?
Yeah, well, I've been playing a Yamaha soprano since 1986. I say soprano, but sopranos. I have, I think, 4 or 5 different models of Yamaha sopranos, and starting with the 62R when they first came out in 1986, I believe. But I recently switched to the Yamaha Alto, the 82Z, the second series,
Right.
with the one-piece bell. And that really has opened up things for me significantly.
What had you been playing on alto prior to that?
Mark 6s, primarily Mark 6s, and before that balance action.
Roughly what vintages?
60,000s.
60,000. So the
Yeah.
early Mark 6s.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And beautiful, beautiful instruments. I mean,
Right.
just the Mark 6s are amazing.
Right. There's
and
very distinctive.
Yeah. And I would lean more towards the darker sound, but having just enough stridency to sing out. But
Right.
I didn't want the edge,
Right.
At least not as part of the sound. I would like it occasionally, but not as part and parcel of the sound. But the Yamaha, since I've switched over to that, has given me even a broader color template, particularly with the low register. I feel like the low register just sings a lot more, and it's flexible. And I've always had an issue with the low register. I'm sure part of it was me and stuff I was probably doing with embouchure or
That's
open.
really people always think the hardest part of the alto is the top notes.
It's the low,
Bottom notes.
That's right.
Tenor
That's right.
players can revel in the bottom of the
That's
tenor
right,
sax,
yeah.
baritone play, but alto
Yeah.
is a weird thing,
It's
isn't it?
a weird thing because it very seldom sounds good. I mean, even when you can play the notes, it's to get it sounding the way you want it to sound
Right.
like the rest of the horn. And this is something I'm able to do a lot easier on the Yamaha horn. I got it to the point where I could do it on the Mark VI, but this now allows me to do it with so much less effort, and I can color it and shape it, anywhere from subtone to full tone and everything in between.
And have you used the same mouthpiece both for the Mark VI and the Yamaha?
There was a bit of a change there too, because for a long time I used a Selmer soloist on the Mark VI.
Similar to what Kenny Garrett
Yeah,
plays.
yeah, and then when I first tried, then I went to Van Doren mouthpieces, playing the earlier model of the V16 mouthpiece, the one prior to what they're making now, and that's the one that I've been playing, for I don't know how many years now.
Right.
Occasionally I'll do some work with the Selmer piece, depending on the demands, but it's mostly the Van Doren.
Right. So using both Yamaha alto and soprano saxophones now as part of your regular instrumental call.
Yeah.
What instruments do you play on for clarinet and flute?
Yep. R13, Buffet R13 clarinet with Van Doren mouthpieces, various Van Doren mouthpieces.
Right.
And Muramatsu flute. And I just bought a Martin Gordon head joint. He's a maker out of Boston and London. He's another maker that has worked for all of the major flute makers at one time or another.
Right.
And I know he makes his own flutes. And I was at Jeff Weissman's, who's a good friend, and he had a bunch of his head joints in, and I tried this one on the Muramatsu, and it just opened it up beautifully. So that combination gives me a lot of ease of playing, better intonation, much easier in the high register. I can now hit those E's with the more gentle
splitting.
touch. Yeah, right. I could, I wish I'd had that when I first played the Poulenc, when I first started.
Right at the first note.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, interesting. With all the equipment that you've gone through and experienced, do you make a change in your equipment when you, for instance, play in Maria's big band or someone else, the Vanguard big band, as opposed to playing with a smaller group, a quintet, let's say? Is there any change in reeds, mouthpiece, or with regard to Maria's band, when you have to double, do you change the reeds, let's say, for your alto or soprano in order to accommodate the flute doubling? Do you make any conscious changes like that?
Not with the reeds or mouthpieces. Now with soprano, I will play my Yamaha 82 straight soprano with big band. Generally, like if it's Christian McBride's big band or the Vanguard band, because it has a little more focus to the sound, a little more cut. I also use that with the Gil Evans project, because a lot of times I'm playing the Steve Lacy parts.
I see.
And it has a little more point to the sound, which for that music it needs
right.
that.
As opposed to the
as opposed to the curved neck, which
right.
has a lot more color. So I use the curved neck generally with the smaller group stuff.
I see.
But I also use the curved neck with Maria's band, because Maria's band is more like an orchestra.
Yes.
And you have to use a lot of different colors to blend. It's not just saxes versus brass kind of situation. Very rarely is it that. Right. You're usually blending with various combinations of instruments, guitar, maybe two trumpets and a trombone, right. So that gives me a lot more color palette to draw from.
Interesting.
And it's a lot more warmer.
Interesting. Now, with all of these various great leaders you've worked with, from Lionel Hampton in the beginning, and then Chick Corea, Dave Holland, Ron Carter, Christian McBride's big band. Let's talk about some of these leaders and how they've influenced you. So let's start out with Chick Corea. I know there's a video on YouTube that they did on a jazz cruise a number of years ago with you talking about Chick and Dave Holland as leaders. But I think it would be important for our listeners to hear this, because these are two such vital musicians out there today. And I think we can't get enough of either one.
Yeah, well, I agree. I was lucky enough to work with both of them in succession. I went from Dave Holland's band right into Chick Corea's band. And of course, having the history that they had together, with Miles Davis and with Circle.
Back in the 60s.
In the 60s and 70s, and the stuff they did with Anthony Braxton and all of that. But the common thing with them both is that they're not resting on any laurels. They are both pushing ahead with the next chapter, the next musical chapter.
These are guys in their 70s.
In their 70s. And they have the energy of 20-year-olds, in terms of music. When they're on the bandstand, they're all in 110%. And so to be on the bandstand with them and to feel that push and that urgency and that fun factor and just the sheer joy of making music and looking for the unknown. And that was the thing that was great about playing with both of them. Every night they're trying to find the unknown, and they're pushing the sidemen. Hey, let's tap into the unknown. Let's find some new stuff tonight. And that really had a big impact on me.
So when you're a leader and you're out as a leader of your group or promoting, let's say, one of your albums, do you find you thinking back to those moments when you were the sideman and how these other great leaders dealt with you and dealt with their audiences, dealt with the music as far as even what music to play for what audiences, in what order, from set to set? That's a lot. I mean, you've worked with so many great players. It must be wonderful to have that experience to call upon when you are the leader.
Well, absolutely. And I've been informed so much by the leaders I've worked with, just to watch what they do and how they do it on and off the bandstand. And I've picked up so much from all of the leaders I've worked with. Yeah.
Right. And you just came back this past week from a little mini tour out in the Southwest with Maria Schneider, who you've been associated with for a number of years. Can you talk a little bit about Maria as a leader, as well as, a fantastic composer and arranger as well?
Yeah, well, first of all, she's a wonderful person. I mean, what you hear in her music is truly a reflection of who she is. I mean, her Midwestern roots, very humble Midwestern roots, but also she's an advocate of justice. She's right now she's big in activism and justice for artists with all the digital rights that are going on or lack thereof. So she's spoken before Congress several times about that. She's into the preserving the environment, as you may know. She's into birding quite heavily. That's her other passion.
Big ornithologist.
Yes, yeah. She's on the board of, I think, the Cornell Institute of Ornithology or something like that. Yeah. So, but her music is really a reflection of her soul and who she is. And she is a very giving person, very open. She really trusts her members of her band to bring something different and special to the music every night. And that's the greatest thing about playing in her band. Every night is so different, especially when we play different halls, which gives you a different perspective of hearing the music. You hear something different in the music every night because of the acoustics or because of where you might be situated. And you say, oh man, I didn't hear that note the last time. I didn't hear that note coming out of the second trombone. Right. So you get a different perspective of the music, and it keeps it fresh. And of course, everyone in the band is so creative. So it's really a lot of fun because we don't know, once the solos start, it can go anywhere. And she allows that. She allows that kind of freedom. Yeah.
And I know from personal experience how great an educator and a clinician she is, which brings me to your experience now as an associate professor at CCNY here in New York and the head of the jazz department at the school. How did you get into academia? And we'll talk a little about managing the playing career and the teaching career simultaneously.
Well, I obviously when I came to New York, the last thing I thought would happen to me that I would become a teacher, especially at the college level. But I'd been in New York a few years, and then I got a call from Rufus Reed, who was still running the program at William-Patterson in New Jersey at the time. This was 1991. And Joe Lovano had just left the faculty because his career was taking off. And Rufus called me out of the blue. I think I'd met him maybe once before then, and asked me if I'd be interested in teaching there. And I said, well, I would love to give it a try. I had not taught consistently at the college level. I taught a few students here or there, but it ended up being a very rewarding experience and working with some great players, high level, but also some who were not as high. And that was the start of me looking at, I guess, my own approach to teaching and what materials I would like to use and what I was thinking about and what it helped me. So it made me review my whole process of what had gotten me to that point in terms of what I'm thinking about in terms of sound, improvisation, all of the elements of playing the saxophone. And also I started teaching ensembles there. So that started, I guess, I don't know how many years of being an adjunct at different schools, William-Patterson, SUNY Purchase, Manhattan School of Music, Juilliard, and then ultimately City College, which I've been on faculty now for 5 years as a full-time faculty member.
Right. And how long ago did you take over the department as far as head of jazz studies?
Just last year.
Okay. And, now we're in a interesting time in the economy and certainly in the music industry. And it's hard to make a living and certainly hard to look at a 40-year career of playing as being always there. So with that knowledge, because you are an active player and you know what's going on the outside, which so many academics do not,
Right.
as we both know.
Right.
How do you then, or what do you tell your students who you've accepted on an undergraduate or graduate level? What do you tell them about the real world and therefore how to prepare best while they're in school?
Yeah. Well, first thing is to be a student of the music. Learn the history because, of course, every period has its trends of whatever's happening now. As Flip Wilson used to call it in his Reverend Leroy character, the church of what's happening now.
That's right.
But, I tell them, look, understand, even just with the saxophone, how the evolution of the instrument, who were the great practitioners, who inspired Charlie Parker, who inspired Dexter Gordon, who inspired John Coltrane. Go back and see who inspired each one of them, because you can trace that and you can back to then and you can hear it up to now.
And just using Coltrane as an example is perhaps the greatest example of someone who kept looking back and trying to find the roots. And it's been well documented his ability, his searching ability, and his discovery of Sidney Bechet and how that led him to look at the soprano as an important voice.
It's a prime example, absolutely. But also a student of the music and a student of culture, because music has a cultural context. It's important to understand the cultural context of any genre, any style of music, because it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It doesn't happen with just a bunch of musicians in a practice room or a rehearsal room just coming up with ideas. Because today, with the technology at hand, which I think can be a good thing, but the tendency is to stay home as an individual and sort of go, okay, well, let's see if I can, cross the X with the Y and, and put in the lab. And then, no, music is humanity. It's a reflection of humanity. And you have to have human contact and interaction for real music to take place, for the most honest music to take place.
Right. So it's not just playing along with play-alongs on your computer, which is helpful, of course, and it's wonderful to have a rhythm section to practice a tune with.
Sure, it could be a great tool.
Right. But there's no substitute.
No, and it's not the end all. So I urge them to be a student of all of that, but also to go out and see the living masters. Don't make the mistake of saying, well, I'll wait and I'll go see them 6 months from now, especially if they're in their 80s and 90s, because I've made that mistake with a couple of them, and I have regrets about it, that I never got off of my butt and went down to the club and saw this great master while I had the chance. So I tell them, don't miss that. Don't miss that opportunity, because you cannot assume that, everyone's going to be around forever.
Right.
So that also, but also to network with students at other schools, because this is a big community, and this is the community you're going to be dealing with as a student and as a professional when you get out of school. So I tell my students, and I've done this at every school, hey, if you are at City College, go to recitals and rehearsals at Manhattan and Juilliard and New School and Jersey City and William Patterson and Queens, because these are the people you're going to be networking with. This is your generation. And it's an international network now, because these students are coming from all over the planet. And these are the kind of networks they're going to need professionally, because there's just not enough work even in New York to sustain oneself.
Right.
Unless you're lucky enough to get a steady gig or Broadway or something, but that's a rare thing these days.
Yes, and what's steady on, having lived through that scenario of the industry, you might have a show, it might last 2, 3, 5 years, 10 years, but when that show ends, you're back at square one.
That's it. Yeah.
And there's no guarantees.
That's right.
And so, you have to constantly keep searching, growing, and meeting people, like you say, networking, and understanding what the levels are out there. I remember when I was teaching full-time for many years, I would always tell my students, well, you may be the best here, but you ought to hear the kids at Juilliard
Yeah.
or Manhattan School. You ought to hear what that level is.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
that's the level you're competing at.
That's it. Yes.
And the other aspect is that when they get out of school, they're not only competing with their level, they're competing with you.
That's
you know,
it.
I
Yeah.
mean, and I used to tell them when, that someone, maybe a student was a little, talented and certainly a little bit feeling cocky about their abilities. I said,
Right.
well, you think you're going to replace Chris Potter with Dave Holland?
Right.
Or you're going to replace Lovano, or you're going to play lead alto over Oates and the Vanguard Band. Do you
Right.
really think well, until you're that level,
That's it.
and those folks don't feel that way. That's
right.
the other part of it.
Exactly.
The
Exactly
great players understand the infinite aspect of music.
Absolutely. That we're all trying to get better. We're all trying to be better at our craft.
Yeah.
I was telling a student of mine today, when I first got to New York and started hanging out in sessions and going around listening to people, and I remember the first time I heard John Gordon, who's a dear friend of mine, and I had just met him, but I hadn't even met him yet, but I was up what is now the Club Smoke, and it used to be called Augie's.
Yes, right.
Just a dive that it was, but that's where all the great young musicians played. And I walked in one night, and I didn't know him then, but there was John playing, and I remember to this day he was playing a blues in G, and was just killing. I mean the sound, that sound we talk about with the focus, the projection. I went, wow.
Well,
who
he
is
had
this
that. He
guy?
had that Phil Woods mentoring.
That's right. That's right.
That's always a mentor is important.
Yeah, and then of course running into Justin Robinson at jam sessions who've been studying with Frank West, and hearing that level of these players, these young players, and I said, man, that's what I'm going to have to get to, because that's the bar, that's the level that these guys are on, and it made me go home and practice and figure things out and listen and go out and listen some more, but seeing those guys like that is what said, that's what you need to get together,
It's such a valuable lesson, and one that we are always continually learning and being refreshed by.
Yeah.
So one thing I wanted to ask you, and that we're going to have you demonstrate a little bit, is how you approach learning a tune, a new tune. For instance, you were talking about in your practice routine that you always devote some time to the new material.
Yeah.
But actually how you go about it, if there's a process, or some of the means, the tools you use to learn about a new tune so that you become fluent in it and don't have to think about it when you're on the gig, in a sense.
Yeah. Well, if it's a standard tune or a standard type of tune, first the melody. That's the first thing. Like, what's the melody? Because oftentimes the melody will give you the harmony. At least in a sort of a more of a standard tune, American songbook type of tune context. You can get most of the harmony from the melody usually, and then I will go back and figure, okay, what are the roots? What's going on with the chord changes, and just see what the motion is between the melody and the roots. I actually have a little exercise I do on Cone Alma, which we'll talk about, and I'll demonstrate that. We talk about my rep class, but so what's the voice leading? What are the 2/5s? Where are the 2/5s? Where are the different resolution points? What are the tonal centers? And what's the phrasing of the melody? Is it 4 + 4 + 4? Is it 4 + 2 + 3? And that will help me to learn the cadences better and the cadences of the melody. So I'm basically trying to analyze the tune in terms of where the strong points of resolution form, and what is the composer's intent, as much as I can figure out in the song. What's the apex of the melody? How lyrical can it be? How lyrical can I be with the melody? Because I'm really trying to tell a story with the song. So that's kind of a basic approach that I'll learn from that. And then I'll go back. I'll play the melody several times. I'll go to the piano, look at the chords, the bass motion, maybe just play the chords, sing the melody, so I can get them both in my ear at the same time. And then I'll go back to the horn, play along, and usually try to spell out the harmony, or we'll try to hear the harmony as I'm playing the melody. And basically just doing a repetition of that as much as I need to in terms of memorizing it.
Right. Interesting. Well, we're going to look forward to you demonstrating that now, and I want to thank you again for sharing your time and your knowledge and your experience with us here, because I hope this will benefit many of our listeners, especially the younger generation of listeners. And it's important that they, understand the process and understand that it's a lot of hard work that goes into becoming a masterful player like yourself, and it just doesn't happen overnight.
I know.
And it must happen every night.
Yeah, there you go. And it is a process.
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you, Ed. Appreciate
it very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, and we hope you'll come back for our next edition of the Woodwind Legacy Series. Thank you.
All right, so this is sort of a what I call a creative exercise, creative practicing. And I'm going to demonstrate this with the tune Con Alma by Dizzy Gillespie. It's a really great, beautiful song. Very intriguing tune because it has a very basic, simple melody, but constant shifting tonal centers. So I'll just demonstrate that. So the melody is really in the A section. It says AABA tune, 32 bars, 8 bars each section. And the melody, its most basic component, is actually chromatic in the A section. So there's really just these notes. I'll play them faster just so you can hear what the notes are. So. And in real time, it's but you can hear how that basically is an embellishment of that chromatic, of this chromatic line. Okay, so now we've identified the most basic shape of the melody. So that gives me a clue in terms of how I can begin to memorize it, because now I know what those basic notes are. And the bass line, the roots of the chords, are basically it's a counter melody. So it's and then that's repeated. That's the A sections. So you can hear it's basically like a scale, a descending scale against that stationary melody. And on the bridge, it's a 2/5 progression in concert B flat minor, and then a 2/5 progression in E major, and then temporarily goes back to E flat major before going to E major again at the top of the form. So the roots in the bridge are and going back to the last A section. So you can see we've pared it down to the most basic elements of the tune. So with that said, Con Alma lends itself, one of the great things about the tune Con Alma is it lends itself to being played in 4/4 swing, 3/4 swing, sort of a 6/4 feel a la Footprints, Wayne Shorter, but also an Afro-Cuban tradition. So 12/8, 6/8, and you can begin to use the different claves in that as well. So I'll demonstrate a little bit of all of these things. So one of the ways that I like to practice Con Alma, and it gets me into this creative practicing mode, I like to think of maybe some of the Bach cello suites approach. So basically you can arpeggiate, and I'll go through that, each chord, starting on the A section, the E major chord. The next chord. Right? So we have the E chord. Then we have the A flat 7 over E flat, the fifth in the root. in D flat minor, B7, B flat 7, to E major, E flat major, sorry. Now we go 2-5, we're going to go 2-5 to D flat major. Okay, so now we have D flat coming from D flat. So F7 to B flat minor to A flat 7, G7 to C major. So that's the A section of the tune. So now I'll just kind of play a little bit in time just so you can hear the whole progression. So just kind of a basic arpeggio exercise that you can use to learn how this tune moves. So now what I will do is I'll maybe now try to play it in a certain time section. Actually, I'm going to go right into like sort of a 12/8 kind of feel on the tune and use more of this sort of arpeggio intervallic approach to playing over it. I should mention that I'm using the 12/8 and I'm using the clave and the bembe rhythms. So the clave is and the bembe so forth and so on. So that's the reference now that I'm going to play this exercise over. So what I'm trying to do is to play in that 12/8 kind of rhythm with an arpeggiated style, but none of these things are predetermined. So the challenge is up to you, the improviser, in terms of keeping pace, in terms of keeping the form, in terms of keeping the rhythm. But this is a great way to not only learn the tune, but to also figure out some different rhythmic approaches that you might take. And then now I'll take that same rhythm, maybe now go to 4/4 swing. So again, we came from (12/8) rhythm. Now we're going to go to 4/4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3. So that's another way that you can also transition going from 12/8 to 4/4. So this is what I call creative practicing, where you can take a tune, you boil it down to its most basic elements in terms of melody, in terms of harmony, and then you can put different rhythms to it. And Konalma is the perfect vehicle to do that because it's a very flexible tune in terms of rhythm because it has that simple melody with the constantly shifting harmony. So I hope that you give that a try and have fun with it.